Official history textbooks invariably describe the 19th century as an era of unprecedented technical progress, a triumph of science and romanticism. We are painted pictures of gallant gentlemen, the invention of steam engines, and the flourishing of literature. However, behind this glossy facade lies a grim reality that academic science prefers to shamefully keep silent about, or speak of only in whispers. If we cast aside the romantic veil and look at events globally, it becomes obvious. This was a century of total, ceaseless world slaughter. We are indoctrinated to believe that the planet was shaken by scattered, local conflicts. Allegedly, Britain was simply expanding its colonial possessions, the United States was dealing with internal contradictions, and China was suffering from trade disputes. But this version crumbles to dust the moment you compare the scale and geography of the events. If we turn to the dry language of facts and chronology, ignoring emotional assessments and political interpretations, a frightening picture of synchronicity opens up before the researcher. It is enough to simply line up the events of the mid-19th century on a single timeline to see that the world wasn't just feverish, it was burning in a single flame. The entire globe was engulfed in hostilities in one incredibly compressed decade. In 1848, Europe flared up with a series of revolutions known as the Spring of Nations. As if on command from an invisible conductor, social explosions occurred in almost all capitals simultaneously. Barely had the smoke cleared over the European cobblestones when, in 1850, on the other side of the world in China, the so-called Taiping Rebellion began, a conflict of monstrous proportions. Just 3 years later, in 1853, the Crimean War broke out, where the world's leading powers converged their fleets on a single point. A few years later, in 1857, India was shaken by the Sepoy Mutiny. And by 1861, the bloody confrontation between the North and South began in the United States of America. This chain of catastrophes was completed by the Paraguayan War, which started in 1864 and led to the almost complete disappearance of the population of an entire country. Does it not seem strange to you that the planet went up in flames everywhere and all at once? Official science suggests we believe in a random coincidence, naming a separate, isolated reason for each conflict. Here, economics; there, religion; elsewhere, the struggle for independence or the abolition of slavery. However, from the point of view of elementary logic, such a density of events cannot be accidental. When a fire starts at the same time in the living room, the attic, and the basement, no one in their right mind would claim it is just a coincidence of faulty wiring and careless handling of fire. It is obvious that the building is being torched, and it is being done systematically, according to a pre-approved plan. In the 19th century, our common home was set on fire intentionally, and the intensity of this process left no chance for containing the blaze. It was a global territory cleanup. The aggressor in this scheme is quite clearly visible. It is the coalition of Western powers forming the New World Order, the British Empire and its allies, whose interests surprisingly coincided on all continents. But the main question that arises when analyzing this synchronized slaughter concerns not the attackers, but the defenders. Against whom was such power deployed? Who were they actually protecting? And whom were they destroying, with bayonets and cannons, from the American prairies to the Great Wall of China? Explanations about peasant riots and internal strife stop working if you assess the scale of resources involved and the level of casualties. You do not gather united fleets or wage wars of extermination for decades against scattered rebels or poorly armed natives. Obviously, the enemy possessed strength, organization, and resources that posed a real threat to the advancing New World. The answer to the question of who exactly this total war was waged against lies in the nature of the destruction this era left behind, traces that cannot be hidden even a century and a half later. The most terrible, dark, and bloody page of this global operation to reformat the world was the event known in official historiography as the Taiping Rebellion in China. Academic historians dryly cite casualty figures ranging from 20 to 30 million, while some independent estimates place the number of people destroyed at the monstrous mark of 100 million. Think about that scale. 100 million lives is more than the population of most modern states, and all this happened in the mid-19th century. We are asked to believe that such a demographic catastrophe was the result of a civil war unleashed by religious fanatics and peasants. However, elementary logic and knowledge of warfare cast doubt on this version. Peasant armies armed with hoes and primitive weapons are physically incapable of exterminating such a number of people. To carry out a genocide of this magnitude, an industrial machine of destruction, streamlined logistics, uninterrupted ammunition supply, and artillery of colossal power are needed. Things the rebels simply could not have had. If we look at the surviving engravings and rare photographs of Chinese cities from that period, we see not traces of fires or street fighting, but ruins that are frighteningly reminiscent of the aftermath of 20th century carpet bombing. Stone buildings are not just damaged, they are pulverized, neighborhoods turned into rubble. There is a well-founded version that China at that time was not a backward agrarian territory at all, but one of the last strongholds of an ancient, highly developed civilization, that very Great Asia or Tartaria. Under the guise of suppressing a rebellion, Western powers, in alliance with the Manchu dynasty, methodically destroyed the indigenous population, which possessed knowledge and technologies dangerous to the new masters of the world. It was a cover operation, where total territory cleansing and the erasure of historical memory were carried out under the noise of civil unrest. Moving to the other side of the world, to North America, we find a strikingly similar picture of destruction, which is explained to us as the Civil War between the North and the South. Since childhood, we have been indoctrinated that this was a conflict for the liberation of slaves and the preservation of national unity. But documentary evidence capturing the destroyed cities of the South, Richmond, Atlanta, Charleston, tells a different story. The photographs show brick boxes without roofs, neighborhoods burned to the ground, the jutting skeletons of majestic buildings, and a complete absence of floors. The nature of this destruction raises many questions for any engineer or military expert. Field artillery of the mid-19th century fired cast iron cannonballs that could punch a hole in a wall or destroy part of a parapet. But they did not possess the kinetic energy capable of leveling city blocks down to the very foundation. What we see in American cities of the 1860s surprisingly resembles the landscapes of Dresden or Hiroshima after the air raids of 1945. One gets the feeling that the Army of the North was performing the function not of restoring constitutional order, but of clearing territories where rich city-states, part of the global system of the Old World, were located. The architecture of the South was antique, majestic, impossible to build by colonists arriving in wagons in wild lands. These cities needed to be destroyed to erase the memory of who actually built them, and the population needed to be replaced. The casualty statistics in this war also cause bewilderment. Official figures are constantly corrected upwards, but demographic gaps point to the disappearance of a much larger number of people than is generally accepted. The asymmetry of these wars lay not in tactics, but in the overwhelming technological superiority of one side. We see traces of the use of weapons whose power is orders of magnitude greater than anything that officially existed in the arsenals of that time. Someone had the ability to turn stone into dust and demolish entire metropolises, while the other side could only defend unsuccessfully. But to finally understand the nature of this destructive impact and get closer to solving the mystery of the technologies used, it is necessary to pay attention to the objects that the aggressors tried to destroy with special, maniacal persistence, but could not completely erase. The traces of this struggle lead us to the bastions of Sevastopol and deep into the South American continent, to Paraguay. The Crimean War, presented by official history as a conflict between Russia and a coalition of Britain, France, and Turkey for control of the Straits, turns into one of the most mysterious operations of the 19th century upon closer inspection. If we discard the political rhetoric of that time and look at the map of hostilities, a logical question arises. Why would the world's greatest powers send their huge fleets into the closed Black Sea, spend colossal resources, and besiege a single city, Sevastopol, for years? From a military point of view, such a concentration of forces and means for the sake of one dot on the map looks absurd, unless the true goal differed from the declared one. Sevastopol was not just a strategic port. Its bastions were cyclopean structures, literally carved into the bedrock, with an extensive network of underground communications and complex engineering infrastructure. The claim that such fortifications were erected with picks and shovels by soldiers and sailors under continuous enemy fire does not hold water. The volume of earth and rock work required to create such a system is comparable to building a subway, which is impossible to accomplish under siege conditions in a short time. It is more logical to assume that Sevastopol, like many other so-called star forts around the world, was an object of ancient infrastructure. It was an energy hub, a logistics center, or a technical complex of the previous civilization, which the new masters of the world sought not to capture, but specifically to destroy. The coalition wiped the city off the face of the earth with maniacal persistence, turning antiquity into rubble so that the functionality of this object could never be restored. Looking closely at the descriptions of the invasion armies, one can notice a strange unification. The French, British, Sardinians, yesterday's geopolitical rivals, act as a single mechanism, as if dressed from the same warehouse and following orders from a single center. This resembles a global police operation, where the united army of the New World Order conducts a cleanup. It creates the impression of a kind of rigged match, during which two huge forces destroy an ancient city and at the same time utilize the excess male population of their countries in senseless frontal assaults, labeled by historians as meat grinders. We find an even more tragic and illustrative example of cleansing in South America. The Paraguayan War, which began in 1864, represents an unprecedented act of genocide. Tiny Paraguay stood against giants, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. The outcome of this conflict is monstrous, even by the standards of the cruelest wars. Up to 90% of the male population of the country died. Such statistics testify that the goal was not the defeat of the army or a change of government, but the total physical liquidation of carriers of a specific cultural and genetic code. Historians admit that pre-war Paraguay was a unique state, self-sufficient with developed industry, railways, and telegraphs built without crippling British loans. It was a system country, falling out of the control of the forming global financial web. There is a high probability that Paraguay was a kind of sanctuary, an enclave where, deep in the continent, remnants of the previous civilization remained, trying to survive and preserve their technologies. The coalition of neighbors, generously armed and financed from the outside, played the role of executioner. They physically destroyed the men who remembered the true history, possessed technical skills, and had a spirit of independence. Women and children were left alive to mix blood and create a new, obedient people stripped of memory. Thus, in both hemispheres, we see the same picture: the destruction of the material and human carriers of the old order. However, a serious contradiction arises here that cannot be resolved within the framework of school physics. The bastions of Sevastopol, the forts of America, and the fortresses of Europe were built of granite and high-quality brick. To turn these structures into the ruins we see in old photographs, a simple cast-iron cannonball filled with black powder is not enough. Ordinary artillery leaves divots, but it is incapable of melting stone. And here we approach the most uncomfortable evidence of that era. Traces of thermal impact of such force that it does not fit into official concepts of 19th century technology. The skepticism of official science faces an insurmountable obstacle when it comes to material evidence of mid-19th century destruction. If we leave aside the chronicles, which could have been rewritten, and turn to physics and material science, a picture opens up that is incompatible with the level of technology attributed to that era. Investigating the ruins of fortifications such as Fort Sumter and Fort Pulaski in the USA, fortifications near Paris, or the forts of Kronstadt, researchers discover a phenomenon that cannot be explained by the impact of cast iron cannonballs and black powder. We are talking about vitrification, the process of turning stone and brick into a glass-like mass under the influence of extreme temperatures. We observe granite blocks that flowed like wax and froze in bizarre drips, and brickwork turned into a single vitrified monolith. Physics is relentless here. The melting point of granite is about 1200 degrees Celsius, and for high-quality brick, this threshold can be even higher. An explosion of black powder, even in large volumes, creates a shock wave and fragmentation damage, but it does not generate a sustained heat field of such intensity to melt multi-meter walls into a liquid state. This means only one thing. Weapons of a fundamentally different class were used in the so-called wars of the mid-19th century. The nature of the damage points to the use of powerful thermal, or possibly plasma impact, the operating principle of which is either unknown to the modern public or intentionally classified. This hypothesis finds confirmation in the analysis of the famous Great Fires that swept the world in the same era. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, Spokane, and in Eurasia, Moscow and Kiev, burned according to the same strange scenario. Official versions attributing the destruction of huge metropolises to an overturned kerosene lamp or a spark in a haystack look like a mockery of common sense. Hectares of solid masonry do not burn down from a simple spark. The fire spread at an unnatural speed, leaving residents no chance to evacuate. But most importantly, the consequences. In these fires, steel melted and flowed into storm drains, while stone and brick crumbled into sand, losing their molecular structure. This does not happen during ordinary wood burning, but under the influence of extreme temperatures characteristic of carpet bombing using high-order incendiary mixtures or directed energy weapons. It was a targeted operation to clear architectural heritage. Cities did not just burn, they were destroyed to zero to make room for primitive red brick boxes, which we mistakenly consider historical buildings today. The asymmetry of this war lay in the fact that the attacking side, representing the interests of the emerging new order, likely had access to atmospheric or orbital strike technologies. The defenders, residents of the old city-states, were defenseless. Perhaps their defense systems, those very domes or energy fields vaguely mentioned in legends, were previously disabled as a result of some global failure. People were trapped. Their homes were burned out by directed pulses, turning stone into lava and organic matter into dust. Later, historians would call these events fires at warehouses or accidental ignitions, hiding the fact of the use of weapons of mass destruction. However, even if we accept the version of a high-tech war from the air, the question of ground operations remains open. After all, it is not enough to scorch a territory, it must be occupied. And here, official history falls into its own logistical trap. How could million-strong armies, which we are told about in school, move, be supplied, and conduct active combat operations over gigantic distances with a complete lack of roads and infrastructure, allegedly destroyed or not yet built? The answer to this question forces us to reconsider not only the history of wars, but also the chronology of natural disasters. After analyzing destructive wars and unexplained technological anomalies, we encounter another frightening contradiction, this time demographic. Mathematics is an exact science, and it ruthlessly destroys the official picture of the world's recovery in the second half of the 19th century. If we believe historical reports, a significant part of the male population of the planet died during global conflicts, epidemics, and alleged natural disasters. In some regions, losses reached 90%. The biological laws of reproduction are immutable. The human population is incapable of recovering instantly. A woman cannot give birth to 5 children a year, and a child needs time to grow. However, statistics show an explosive, avalanche-like population growth almost immediately after the end of the Great Slaughter. The population did not just recover, it doubled and tripled in a matter of decades, which is absolutely impossible from a biological point of view. The only rational explanation for this phenomenon lies in a plane that even the boldest researchers are afraid to discuss. We are talking about the mass, artificial filling of territories with new people. It is precisely in the mid-19th century that thousands of huge foundling hospitals and orphanages opened all over the world as if on command. The term "children of the regiment" appears, and in the United States, entire orphan trains circulate, distributing homeless children to empty cities and farms. Where did millions of children without parents come from overnight? Their origins are foggy. Documents are often missing or forged. These children, deprived of ancestral memory and connection with the past, were drilled in conditions of strict discipline, given new, often standardized surnames, and prepared for the role of ideal performers, workers for factories and soldiers for new armies. There is a frightening theory, supported by strange exhibits of those years, that this process was not natural. At the World Fairs of the late 19th century, incubators for infants were openly demonstrated to the public. We are told these were medical devices for premature babies, but the scale and context of their use suggest technologies for artificial cultivation or cloning. Perhaps this is how the problem of depopulation was solved. The new masters of the world created a service human, a bio-robot, biologically identical to previous people, but with a clean hard drive instead of the memory of ancestors. Parallel to the physical filling of the void, a reformatting of consciousness was taking place. Entire ethnic groups appear that did not exist on maps before. In the offices of linguists, literary languages are created and implemented, dialects are standardized, and new grammatical norms are introduced. A single proto-language, which the world may have spoken before the catastrophe, is intentionally fragmented into dozens of artificial dialects. This was done to implement the principle of divide and conquer. People who did not remember their kinship were artificially made strangers to each other, creating barriers of misunderstanding and laying the foundation for future conflicts. We, living today, are highly likely the descendants of this very generation. Those who were settled in cleansed cities or grown to service the new system. We were not just conquered, we were replaced. But this new population, despite their erased memory, still had eyes. They saw majestic ruins, star forts, and incredible architecture that their primitive colonist ancestors could not have built. So that the new people would not ask unnecessary questions, capable of destroying the fragile construction of lies, it was necessary to pull off the grandest scam in human history, to completely rewrite reality and substitute the past. To consolidate the success of the physical replacement of the population and finally establish the new order, the Occupation Administration staged a grandiose spectacle designed to legalize the stolen heritage and erase the memory of its true creators. The central act of this production was the so-called World Fairs of the late 19th century, held in Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, and other major centers. Official history tries to convince us that these incredible architectural complexes, consisting of majestic palaces, towers, artificial canals, and fountains, were erected from plaster, hemp, and wood for just one season, solely for the entertainment of the public. We are asked to believe that colossal resources were spent on creating temporary sets, which, in terms of engineering complexity and aesthetic perfection, surpassed anything the modern construction industry is capable of building. However, the absence of photos of the phased construction of these giants and their monumentality suggests that the World Fairs were a cynical operation of appropriation. The new masters of the world found surviving, mothballed urban complexes of the old civilization, carried out cosmetic repairs, and opened them to the public under the guise of their own achievements. Visitors, those very new people without ancestral memory, were shown the remnants of past grandeur, presented as the triumph of industrial progress of the current era. And immediately after the exhibitions closed, these architectural masterpieces were ruthlessly destroyed, blown up, burned, or dismantled for building materials. This was the destruction of evidence. People were shown a paradise in which they could live, and then it was wiped off the face of the earth, accustoming them to the thought that beauty is short-lived, and the norm of existence is gray concrete boxes. An even more sinister element of these exhibitions were the human zoos. Representatives of supposedly wild tribes brought from the colonies were kept in enclosures. But if you look closely at the documentary evidence, many of these savages, dressed in rags, had noble European facial features. There is a version that these were surviving representatives of the old elite, taken prisoner, stripped of everything, and put on display for ridicule. It was an act of psychological suppression. The crowd was instilled with the idea that the past is savagery and primitivism, and the new power is the only path to light and civilization. We were made to believe in evolution from the monkey, although in reality, humanity was forcibly lowered to a level close to an animal through the deprivation of divine heritage and technologies. Parallel to the visual deception, a total cleansing of the information field was underway. All over the world during this period, major libraries and archives burned. The fire in the Library of Congress, the destruction of chronicles in China and European book depositories, these are not accidents. Technical documentation, maps of the real world, and knowledge about free energy, ether, and atmospheric electricity disappeared in the fire. True knowledge was replaced by the Prussian education system, introduced everywhere precisely in the mid-19th century. Barracks-type schools, where children were forced to sit motionless for hours and memorize dogmas, were created not for enlightenment, but for training. Their goal was to kill the creative principle and raise an ideal executor who would never ask a question about the discrepancy between what is written in the textbook and what he sees with his own eyes. As a result of this operation, we were artificially thrown back in development by thousands of years. The technological breakthroughs that appeared like an avalanche at the end of the 19th century, radio, electricity, automobiles, are presented to us as the genius insights of loners like Edison, Tesla, or Bell. But most likely, these people were not inventors, but talented archaeologists who were allowed to decipher and adapt a small part of the surviving technical documentation. The winners appropriated the technologies of the defeated, but gave us only their degraded, commercially profitable versions. Instead of the clean and infinite energy of the ether that powered the destroyed star forts, humanity was put on the needle of hydrocarbons, coal, oil, and gas. We were given primitive technologies of burning resources so that we would depend on energy suppliers, forgetting that once electricity was as free and ubiquitous as air. Putting the scattered fragments of this mosaic together, we come to an inevitable and frightening conclusion that completely changes the perception of surrounding reality. The 19th century was not a springboard for progress, as we were assured, but an insurmountable barrier separating humanity from its true history. We live on the graveyard of a great civilization without even suspecting it, and our cities are built on foundations whose creation is no longer within our power. Everything we are used to considering achievements of the industrial era is actually the result of degradation. We were intentionally thrown back in development, deprived of access to clean and boundless energy sources, replacing them with primitive burning of hydrocarbons, which allows every step and every resource to be controlled. The benefits of civilization that we are so proud of today, from radio waves to electricity, are just miserable crumbs, adapted remnants of technologies that we were allowed to use. We are like savages who found a smartphone and use it as a mirror, unaware of its true capabilities. All official history, written by the victors, is not a chronicle of real events, but a cover legend, carefully developed by the occupation administration. Kings, emperors, and presidents of that era look not like sovereign rulers, but like appointed managers whose task was to legalize the redistribution of property and ensure the uninterrupted functioning of the new system of exploitation. Revolutions and social upheavals were merely instruments of cleansing and asset redistribution, a spectacle to divert attention while a global paradigm shift was taking place behind the scenes. However, the truth, like grass through asphalt, breaks through the thick layer of lies. It screams to us from the facades of antique buildings, whose first floors have gone deep underground, buried by clay of unknown origin. It is visible on ancient maps, where hundreds of cities of Tartaria and other vanished states are marked in the place of supposedly wild wastelands of Siberia and America. The memory of the past shows through even in old cemeteries, where tombstones before the mid-19th century are often devoid of the usual Christian symbolism, but decorated with urns, inverted torches, or solar signs, testifying that our ancestors professed a completely different worldview and, perhaps, lived much longer than we do. The system holds solely on our ignorance and fear of admitting the obvious. We were convinced that we are the crown of creation, the result of long evolution, while facts indicate that we are survivors of a shipwreck who have lost their memory and bearings. We inhabit stage sets whose meaning is forgotten and use tools whose operating principle we understand only superficially. Now each of us faces a fundamental choice: to continue believing in the cozy but false fairy tale from the school textbook, where the world is understandable and safe, or to gather the courage and open our eyes. The realization that history was rewritten and civilization reset is the first step towards returning one's true human dignity and perhaps towards restoring lost knowledge. Reality is much more complex and tragic than we were allowed to know, but only by accepting it do we stop being obedient cogs in someone else's machine and gain a chance for a genuine future.